Water voles were once a common sight across the freshwater landscapes of Britain. However, over the last 100 years their numbers have plummeted. Despite being small, this hardy animal has survived several ice ages, but due to the actions of humans, the habitat they have evolved with is fast being destroyed. Such impacts on the environment has seen water voles vanish from 90% of their former habitat range, making them one of the most endangered mammals in Britain. We take a closer look at the reasons behind the dramatic decline in water vole populations and what can be done to save this valuable species from being lost from Britain forever. The conservation of water voles wouldn't be possible without the dedicated teams of wildlife organisations that are working tirelessly to re-establish water voles across Britain. In 2007, the Essex Wildlife Trust set up the Essex Water Vole Recovery Project. Darren Tansley, who works for the Essex Wildlife Trust, has had an important role in this project.
My role within the Wildlife Trust is I'm the Water for Wildlife Officer. That basically is freshwater habitats. So I work a lot on the rivers and wetlands doing restoration work for habitat and also species work.
The Wildwood Trust, which is based in Kent, also plays a vital role in the conservation of British wildlife. They have captive breeding and reintroduction programs for a wide range of species, one of which is the water vole. Vicky Braycall is the Conservation Officer at the Wildwood Trust.
So there's three ways that Wildwood's involved with water vole conservation. The first of which is we assist with mitigation projects. That means that we work alongside environmental consultants and we look after voles that are coming from sites that are going to be developed. The other side to what we do is we provide like a consultancy service. So we can do water vole surveys, we can do field sign surveys, and we can determine presence or absence of water voles within an area. And the last thing that we do is we captive breed water voles for reintroductions.
There are also independent consultancies dedicated to the conservation of water voles. An example of this is the Derek Gow Consultancy, a team of ecological consultants that specialise in water vole mitigation.
I set up a consultancy service to deal specifically with water vole mitigation and conservation projects. In the early 2000s, I think we began in 2003, I set it up because I felt there was a requirement for it. I'd worked with the species on projects in Britain since 1994 and therefore we had fairly significant experience of working with a specific species.
The collaboration of teams such as these is the driving force in the conservation of water voles. To be able to protect this species, it is first essential to understand their habitat and dietary requirements.
Water voles need a good supply of water usually, so that'll be slow flowing or maybe still water, and they also need a lot of vegetation. So they've got this lush vegetation along the edge of the riverbanks where they live. It's partly for food, but it's also cover for them so that they can stay out of sight of predators. Water voles will eat almost anything that's green and growing. They are herbivores. They rarely eat anything else, but sometimes they will eat fish or shellfish. But the vast majority of their diet is vegetation. They tend to like all of the lush stuff that's growing out of the water, so all the sedges and reeds and things like that, but they will eat stinging nettles or all sorts of herbs, and they'll even strip tree bark if they get desperate.
Before being able to develop an effective plan of conservation for water voles, extensive research was first needed to find out more about this species and the reasons behind their dramatic population decline.
So after the last decades, water vole numbers have plummeted. It was the Vincent Wildlife Trust which highlighted the decline in water voles, and they completed 2 national surveys. The first was in 1990 and the second was in 1998. And they basically concluded that water voles had declined by 88% across their range, which was huge when you think that these are rodent species, so they can breed huge numbers of individuals and boom the populations. And basically to undergo that kind of decline meant there was something seriously wrong.
The reason for the decline of water voles has been multifold. And I'm not sure we really entirely at this stage completely understand it. Without a shadow of a doubt, it's been habitat change, the intensive grazing of the habitat edged by livestock, the loss of habitat through natural processes in inverted commas, such as scrubbing over, things like us, humans stopping or failing to use trees in a wetland environment. It's had a significant effect on these little animals. They're not big enough to fell trees and create the open, sunny riparian edge habitat they require for themselves.
The introduction of non-native species has also played a large part in the demise of water voles in Britain.
The main problem that they've had in certainly the last 2 or 3 decades is mink, which are a predatory species from North America. They were brought over for fur farming in the 20s and 30s, and they started to escape into the wild at that stage, and by the mid-50s they were breeding on our rivers.
The trouble is, North American mink are the perfect predator for a water vole, especially female and juvenile mink. They are small enough to fit into their burrows, and being a semi-aquatic mammal, a water vole's defence mechanism against the native predators like red fox, mustelids, some birds of prey, they basically plop into the water and they can swim away, and that normally gets them out of most situations. And actually the characteristic plop you hear is a warning to all voles in the area that there's danger about and to get away. If you've got a good healthy population of water voles, you can hear a plop 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 all the way up the riverbank, and it's them just getting away from danger. Unfortunately, because they haven't co-evolved with North American mink in this country, it's meant that they don't know how to get away from them. Like I say, their defence strategy is to plop into the water, and unfortunately the mink can plop in afterwards and swim after them, and then their last ditch effort is to go into one of their bolt holes, and unfortunately if it's a female mink or a juvenile mink, they just swim straight in after them and they can wipe them out.
Water voles may be small animals, but they still play an important role in the ecosystem they inhabit, and there are many reasons why we need to conserve them.
The conservation of water voles may not seem that important. They're just one species of many, but every time we remove a species from an ecosystem, we're having an effect, and we may not understand that long-term effect. So we're kind of playing a game of wildlife Jenga. We're pulling out pieces, hoping that the tower won't collapse.
Conserving the species is really important for a couple of reasons. The first of which is they're an important part of the natural ecosystem in this country. When you think that they are part of the food chain, even though they're probably pretty low down on the food chain, they are an integral part. And when you start to have changes, or you start to lose species within that natural ecosystem, that can have an effect on the species that depend on them. So, for example, the native predators, you have otters, which would take a few water voles. They'd probably take the more slower, so the weaker or elderly voles. So everything kind of fits into place, and it's all part of a natural ecosystem, and if you start to lose one element of it, then pressures are put onto the other species.
Not only are water voles an important prey component in the food chain, their behaviour influences the biodiversity of the riparian ecosystem they inhabit.
They're important because they create a whole range of microhabitats for, so they're browsing pressure at the edges of small streams in the headwaters of river systems can completely change the plant composition and structure of those environments. So they mow very many lawns, create very many burrows. They have underground latrine systems which leave build-ups of nutrients in these watercourses, which are generally nutrient impoverished. So in considerable concentrations, they're an important little animal in a water edge environment. But they're also important because they're our legacy. They're something that we're going to have to make up our mind in Britain at this time in our lives at the beginning of the 20th century, whether we're actually going to make an effort to help them and to restore them, or to just abandon it and walk away. At the end of it all, this is an animal that's been with us on this island through many different ice ages, and it's still survived. And now, because of what we've done to the landscape, introduction of non-native predators, and landscapes change on a scale that is simply breathtakingly staggering, they're dwindling to the point of extinction. So it's our responsibility to do something about it.
With the increased knowledge concerning the negative impacts causing water voles to decline, conservation efforts began to be developed. One of the most important strategies is to effectively control American mink populations.
Unfortunately, people don't always agree with mink trapping and the end result of what happens if you trap a mink, but mink aren't native to this country. They're an introduced species, and they're having a huge impact on our native mammals, on water voles, and it's really important that that's dealt with and that's managed. So using mink rafts, which were designed by the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, and it's basically just 2 pieces of ply with a bit of polystyrene in the middle, a hole in the middle, and then a plastic basket is filled with Florist Oasis and then clay on top of that. That's then submerged into the water, and then a wooden tunnel goes over the top, and then that floats out into the water. It's obviously tied off to the bank so it doesn't float downstream. But it just means if mink are there, because they are very inquisitive, they will investigate this raft that's just entered their habitat, and they will walk through the tunnel, and because the oasis keeps the clay nice and damp, it means it leaves their footprints on the clay. And that's great, because then you can determine whether it's a mink footprint, or if it's a water vole footprint, or if it's an otter footprint. You can then sort of start to ID what's actually used in that raft. Once you do have a positive sign of mink, then you'd put a live trap into the tunnel, and then you can humanely dispatch the animal. It is illegal to release that animal once you have trapped it. I think it's really important that more people get on board with the mink raft surveying and trapping, because if everyone works together, you've got more of an impact on reducing the mink numbers.
Specific projects that apply these conservation strategies have been set up across Britain with the aim to re-establish water voles in freshwater habitats.
So if we want to try and increase the number of water voles, we need some coordinated effort amongst landowners, conservationists, gamekeepers, all sorts of different people from different walks of life. And in Essex, that's been achieved through the Essex Water Vole Recovery Project, where we're linking up with over 200 different organisations and individuals to monitor the presence of the invasive mink, remove those where they are, and also to improve the habitats for the water voles. This allows them to naturally recolonise. If we can't get natural recolonisation, that's when we have to move to reintroduction, and we actually physically bring water voles onto a watercourse and we release them into the wild.
In the early 2000s, little was really known about the mitigation for water voles, but over the past decade, these processes have been developed and are proving to be successful in helping water voles to begin recolonising freshwater landscapes in Britain. The Wildwood Trust plays an important role in water vole relocation projects. Claire Stalford is the water vole keeper at Wildwood and cares for the water voles in their breeding programme.
We've got a few different types of cages here in the yard. The big cages that we have, they're mainly used for breeding pairs or for groups of animals. So they've got a whole straw bale, so it's a nice big size, and that kind of mimics the side of a riverbank, so they can dig into that and they can make their burrows. So in there we'd normally have either a breeding pair, so there's plenty of space for all the babies, or it might be a single sex sibling group when we've separated those families and we're overwintering them ready for the next year. Every time we clean out a cage, we'll health check that vole, and we try and do that sort of every couple of months, because we don't want to stress them out too much by doing it regularly, but we also want to be able to keep an eye on them. So what we'll do is we'll take them into the shed. In there we can have a little look at them, and we can sort of give a visual check of how they're walking and stuff in the bottom of the bin. We use a tube because it's kind of like a burrow and they're more likely to run into a tube, so we'll try and get them to go into the tube face first. We're going to try and flip the vole over so that we can check its breeding condition. So we sort of pull it out of the tube a little bit, flip it up onto its back and have a little feel about. We're looking to see if it's a female, whether she's perforate or imperforate, if it's a male, whether or not he has any sort of testicles that are obvious there, so we know what breeding condition they're in. Then we sort of pull them out of the Pringles tube and have a little look at them properly. So we check their teeth are nice and straight and wearing evenly, we check their eyes are nice and bright, we look for any signs of parasites, we look for signs of fighting, any wounds or anything they might have. Next, what we do is we give them a dose of Advocate, and it's basically something that just helps remove any kind of parasites from the animal. So we pop them onto the table and one person restrains the animal down while the other person puts a little drop of it just on the back of their neck. Then we pop them back into the Pringles tube and we weigh it, and then that's it. Then they go back into their cage. We have a breeding stock here on site and we breed every year to keep all our bloodlines nice and healthy. We also provide animals for release programs, and that really depends on different projects that are going on in different places. At the time, people will let us know, maybe sometimes a couple of years in advance, sometimes a bit sooner, how many they'd like, and we can sort of get involved with that and provide voles for that. We also help with mitigation as well, so sometimes some work will be getting done on a site somewhere which will require the voles to be moved. So they'll often come here. If it's just a short project that's going on, the same voles will go back out into the wild. However, sometimes things can take a long time if they've got to regrow all the plant life and everything afterwards, or find another suitable site. So we'll keep the voles here and we will breed those voles and keep that sort of genetic line going so that we can then re-release voles back when sort of the mitigation for that project's over and when that's done.
In previous years, the Wildwood Trust has collaborated with the Essex Wildlife Trust, helping to breed and care for water voles in a large-scale relocation project.
So Essex Wildlife Trust, we try to get involved with projects that will further the conservation of water voles, and one project was the River Cone project, where we were reintroducing just around about 600 water voles. These were originally displaced from a site on the Thames estuary where a new container port was being built. The water voles were taken temporarily and housed at Wildwood in Kent, where they were looked after while we were waiting for the habitat to be right for the release. And then they were brought to Essex, and over a period of about 3 years we released different batches along different parts of the river. They've now started to meet up and recolonise all of those gaps, and so we actually have a catchment scale recolonisation of water voles on the River Cone now.
The Essex Wildlife Trust has recently been involved with another relocation project. A population of water voles needed to be moved between two nature reserves, Fingering Hoe Wick in Colchester and Thorley Wash in Bishop Stortford. Andy May is the Conservation Officer at the Essex Wildlife Trust and has been overseeing this project.
The site of Fingering Hoe Wick was allocated to be realigned due to a number of factors. One of the factors is that we're losing a lot of salt marsh and soil habitat over the years due to coastal squeeze and sea level rise, and the site at Fingering Hoe Wick was identified due to its sustainability and the location. The whole process to breach the seawall Fingering Hoe had to undertake planning conditions. With the planning conditions, we had to submit a full environmental impact assessment. Once the planning conditions had been approved, we started the works this year, and the breach is going to happen in September with a fallback position in October due to the health and safety reasons.
Unfortunately, the site allocated to be breached was home to a population of water voles.
The water voles at Fingering Hoe Wick has been there for many years, and along the new site that we're taking on, they colonised the Barrow Dyke. When we surveyed them, we obviously saw the presence of them. The water voles are protected, legally protected, and what we wanted to do is make sure that the water voles were removed off-site before any works commenced.
To undertake this project, Darren Tansley worked alongside staff from Derek Gow's consultancy, who had the Natural England licence required to carry out the relocation of the water voles.
There are a lot of different procedures that you have to go through. The trapping itself you have to do before the breeding season. You daren't trap a female water vole that's already given birth to young that are then vulnerable to starvation if you remove that animal. So we set about 150 traps, cage traps. They have a little nest box in with food and bedding in, and then a tunnel which has a little trip treadle on it. So when the water vole goes in to eat the apple, the door goes down and they're contained inside. So all of those voles were then taken away, and we would check the sex of them, their health, weigh them, and then they were taken off to captivity to await release.
After all the water voles had been caught at Fingringhoe Wick, they were transported to Derek Gow's holding facilities in Devon.
The animals that were caught there were not sufficient to form a viable free-living population. We now know that this is not an entirely simple species, that it requires to have other subpopulations of water voles existing in the surrounding landscape around it, and that those populations have got to be unrelated to it so they can establish durable metapopulations. So what we did was that we collected animals up as a result of other mitigation projects elsewhere in southern England. We combined those with the animals from the Essex Wildlife Trust site to create a population of about 160 animals, and we released them together into Thorley Wash to hopefully re-establish a much larger and much more vigorous population.
An essential part of the relocation process is choosing the correct location to release the water voles, as the most suitable habitat will increase the chances of a successful recolonisation to that site.
So when we looked at the River Stort originally, we knew the river valley was really good and that it would take water voles. They'd been there in the past, but they weren't there anymore. And we looked at 3 nature reserves, 2 on the Essex side and 1 on the Hertfordshire side. And the Hertfordshire one was chosen in the end, Thorley Wash, because it had a really good diversity of habitat. It had ditches on the site which were in really good condition. It had a back channel which ran along the one side of the site, and then it had a canal on the other side of the site. There was around about 2.5 kilometres of habitat that could be used, and that was enough for us to be able to release the number of voles we wanted. We did have to wait until June for the vegetation to get to a condition that we felt was right, but that was fantastic, really good quality habitat throughout the site.
Once the habitat at Thorley Wash was in a suitable condition, the water voles were transported from Devon to begin the process of release.
We've got 2 types of release. We've got a soft release and a hard release. The hard release is basically just tipping a vole into the water and letting it get on with its life. The reason why that's called a hard release is because they've got no burrow or food already for them. They've got to make their own way. But within a soft release, you can do 2 different types of soft release. We've got pens which just sit on the bank side, and they'll be in there for a few days. We're feeding them, they've got bedding, and then we release them and they can come and go as they want from that location. So they actually have some sort of security while they're just trying to find their way over those first few days. And the other way we can do it is we can literally dig a hole in the ground and we put a pen which doesn't have a floor to it, and they burrow their own way out. By the time they get to the river, they've got their own ready-made burrow system with lots of food that we're providing at the top end. And this is particularly used for family groups where we've got a female and some dependent young, and she can burrow her way out. The young will follow her, and hopefully then they're released and they disperse naturally.
To continue to learn from relocation projects, the water voles were radio tracked to determine their movements after their release.
On some of these projects, we really want to know a little bit more detail about what happens to the voles, especially in those first 2 weeks when they're pretty vulnerable because they don't know their way around. They're on a totally new site and they're trying to locate somewhere to bed down. So in this case, we've used radio tracking as our way of monitoring them. Just a small portion of the population, 10 voles in this case, and we fit a collar which is attached to a cable tie. It goes right the way around their neck, and we just tighten it enough so that it won't come off, but it's not too tight. and then we're able to follow the signal that the radio collar is transmitting, and we can literally get to within a metre or so of where the vole is sitting. So we do that radio tracking twice a day and try and draw up a picture of where these voles are going, whether they're moving off the site or whether they're staying where we put them. It gives us more information about future projects, what is the habitat they really like.
Not only is it important to gather data immediately after the water voles have been released, their movements need to be continually monitored to determine if and how they are recolonising the area.
One of the most important things about doing a reintroduction is that you don't just put the voles in and let them get on with it and hope for the best. You must monitor everything that's being done. So in the case of Thorley Wash, we're not only monitoring the water voles by doing field sign surveys, actually going out there with surveyors and having a look for signs of water vole activity, but we will also be monitoring the movement of mink in the river valley itself, as well as Thorley Wash. And we'll also continually be looking for signs of the actual water voles themselves by publicising it to members of the public so they can send in their photographs of seeing water voles. But it's just not in isolation. Thorley Wash is almost like the source of water voles for the Stort now. For us, we need to go up and down that river valley and see where the water voles start to spread out and appear in other areas.
Continuing to record the movements of water voles along the River Stort will help to demonstrate whether the recolonisation of water voles in this area has been a success.
Now, at the end of the release, there's obviously no way for us to tell how successful this will be into the future. We'll really know when we get to next spring whether those water voles have managed to survive their first winter and breed successfully, and it'll be the young ones then that we'll be observing rather than the ones that we've put into the reserve. But from the point of view of how smoothly it's all run, we haven't run into any problems during the release. We've seen a lot of water vole activity around already on the site, and we've had our first sightings by members of the public. So as far as we can tell at the moment, everything has run really smoothly, and there's every chance that this will be a successful reintroduction, and we'll know more next year.
It is down to the dedicated staff and cooperation of a wide group of people that make mitigation projects such as these possible. Without their hard work, the future of water voles would be completely different to the outlook they now have.
Their future is entirely dependent upon us. If we create the environments that they're going to live in through adjustments of the Common Agricultural Policy, to create kind of thick, dense river edge habitats and on-farm wetlands, and water voles could once again prosper. If we don't, then the outlook is fairly grim.
The future's a bit uncertain for this animal because it requires a lot of resources and a lot of organisation to be able to make large areas of the landscape safe for the animal. But there's a new national water vole monitoring scheme which is co-sponsored by People's Trust for Endangered Species, the Environment Agency and the Wildlife Trusts, and we're looking to try and consolidate our information about the species and target areas where they need help.
Without the trapping and dispatching of mink, the water voles would certainly disappeared by now. And it's really thanks to the work from various funders and also for the work from landowners undertaking these landscape scale projects, the survival of water vole is likely.
I really do feel there's potential for water voles in Britain. Their numbers have gone through a bit of a turbulent time of late, but I think more and more people are understanding the plight of the water vole and wanting to do more to contribute to their conservation.
It is time for us to stop taking for granted the animals that also call this country their home. With the knowledge we have about how to conserve this species, it is now up to us to work together if we are to save Britain's water voles.